Hello everyone. This is the second part of the story. The Divine Hunter, Chapter 4, First Day for the Newbie. That night, Roy begged Moore and Susie to let him work as the butcher's apprentice. The couple refused at first, but they couldn't keep it up as Roy didn't stop, so they agreed. The couple had been by Roy's side since the day he was born, and they thought it was bizarre that Roy's demeanor had completely changed after waking up. He used to be a quiet, timid child, but then he became talkative and expressive. However, the concern shown by Roy toward them wasn't fake, so the innocent couple didn't suspect anything. Instead, they felt relieved about their son's change. They thought that the accident matured him and made him grow up. When the next day came, the Kaer villagers were surprised to see a frail Roy following the butcher around. Did Moore's kid turn insane after almost getting crushed? He's as weak as a girl. He can't butcher anything. Oh, what do you know, you bumpkin? The boy had a brush with death. Of course he's going to change, but I bet he won't last the week. Not everyone can be a butcher, and it's a lucrative job. Why'd Fletcher want to share with him? The villagers gossiped about him, but Roy ignored their nasty comments. All he wanted to do was work with Fletcher, but after a day, he found out that a butcher's job was different from what he'd had in mind. After the bigger livestock were sent to the butcher's place, Fletcher would feed the cows and goats some yellow powder that would paralyze them to prevent them from struggling as they were killed. Fletcher told him the powder was an anesthetic the village's herbalist gave him. After killing the livestock came the hardest part, cutting up the meat perfectly. If they wanted to keep the muscle intact after cutting it, the butcher had to have a thorough understanding of the anatomy of cows, goats, and pigs. Fletcher wasn't talented enough to draw the anatomy of the livestock. All he could do was teach Roy through action. When Roy saw Fletcher calmly skin the cow, disembowel it, and fillet the meat, he started to puke. The stench of the cow's insides filled the air, becoming a miasma of everything that was foul in the world. Everywhere he looked, Roy could only see a crimson hue, the cow's blood splattering everywhere. His stomach churned, and he retched again. The kill wasn't much, but the disassembling of the livestock was a great test of his will. The butcher chortled. I knew something was off when you killed a cow so easily yesterday. Now you know how gory this line of work is. Told you it's dirty and exhausting. Why else do you think everyone else stays away from being a butcher? Well, everyone except you, Roy. Of course, you ain't going to get my business this easily. See if you can keep up until the end. When Roy recovered from his retching, his head felt fuzzy, and his legs were starting to turn to jelly. But the butcher didn't give him time to rest. Come here and take the knife. I'll teach you how to make a perfect cut. Let's start with strength control. Start here and cut upward. I set up. The fuck are you cutting? Damn it. Put your back into it. Every little mistake Roy made earned him a harsh scolding from Fletcher. Gods, he complained quietly. Not only does the apprentice have to wade through the bloody scene, they have to endure this scolding and get worked to the bone. It didn't take long for Roy to start feeling sore in his arms. His constitution was 1 point lower than a healthy adult. Because of that, he would tire easily. The exhaustion from his body and soul was starting to take a toll, wearing him down. Why did I ask to be an apprentice? I did this to myself. Even though Roy was grumbling in silence, he finished the job Fletcher gave him. It was more important than his own feelings, but the point here was that every livestock he killed granted him EXP. I am working for someone else after all. Even so, I get to train my body, gain EXP, and I even have meat. Perfect. Nothing to complain about. His first day of being an apprentice finally came to an arduous end after butchering 2 cows. The clients were from another village, and Fletcher received 10 crowns for his service. Business ain't this good every day, Fletcher told him. Kaer only had 100 families or so. Even if they included business from the other villages, it wasn't as if Fletcher had work all the time. When their job was done for the day, Fletcher, in all his generosity, gave Roy a piece of meat the size of his hand. Fletcher didn't see him as free labor either. He'd pay Roy 1 crown per week, but Roy didn't complain. He was just starting out in that line of work, so money wasn't important early on. "What should we do with the innards, Uncle Fletcher? Toss him out?" The world of The Witchēr was similar to the European continent in Roy's past life. Not everyone could stomach the innards of livestock. After the bigger livestock were butchered, their innards would be buried in the wilds and burned. Either that, or they'd be fed to the fish in a river. "Can I take them?" Roy didn't care that much. He lived in Sea Nation in his past life, where everyone ate everything under the sun, and he had his fair share of innards. Innards? So what? Meat is meat. He was a growing boy, and he'd get his hands on any food. As dusk started to fall, the shadows became longer, connecting them to the twilight world. Roy washed the blood from the butcher's yard and left with a heavy, bloody bag of innards. The weight of it almost made him pass out, but he endured. The day of butchering also netted him 10 EXP. As the sun started its descent down the horizon, smoke started billowing above the chimneys of Kaer's rickety houses. The men who'd toiled in the fields for the whole day came back with their hoes thrown over their shoulders. The children, filthy after a day's worth of games, played chase with their livestock in the yard. As the sky darkened, candlelight started illuminating the houses, providing a shred of warmth to the night. Roy took a deep breath. "I wonder how much longer this peace will last." When he was just a short distance away from his home, Roy could vaguely see 2 soldiers coming to the village. They were clad in yellow armor, and they had swords hanging from their belts. Once the soldiers took a few heavy bags, they went back to their cart and left in a hurry. The villagers were already used to the soldiers' arrival, so they didn't react to them. Roy knew what was happening. Everyone in Kaer had to give the ruler of Lower Posada a part of their harvest as tax. The ruler took a whopping 30% of the villagers' harvest, leaving them with just enough to live their lives. Moore had skullcaps and common hop in his yard, and after collecting the harvest, handed 2 bags of dried skullcaps to the ruler. Skullcaps were similar to tobacco leaves on Earth. Whenever they had time, the villagers would whip their pipes out, pop the skullcap in, and puff the smoke. It was their way of living life. Taxes were common everywhere, especially Eastern. Every nation under its rule, including proxy nations, had to pay higher taxes compared to the other 3 northern kingdoms. Because of that, Eastern was constantly under the threat of peasant movements. As Roy went around to chat with the villagers, he found out that a peasant movement had blown up in Aldersburg, southern Eastern. "What the heck is the monarchy thinking? No wonder Eastern lost its rights to both the northern and southern part of the nation in the end. No wonder it became a broken nation. Danger is approaching. I have to race with time." Food was the only thing that could stave off Roy's stress for a while. He still had some rooster meat from the kill from a day ago, and after coming home with beef, Susie cooked up a big pot of meat soup. It still wasn't seasoned, and it was still tasteless, and Roy could still taste the meat stench. Even so, they at least had meat. Fletcher might have discarded the innards, but Roy took them back and cleaned them up. He then scrounged for some celery, wild greens, and salt he gleaned from his parents after a bit of begging. After that, he stir-fried the ingredients. The aroma and stench of meat wafted throughout the house from Roy's stir-fried meat and innards. If it was the old him, Roy wouldn't have eaten a crude dish like that, but his new body didn't mind it. Food was precious in their era, and meat scarce. Also, people only had 2 meals here, so a growing boy like him wouldn't let go of any chance to gobble meat up. Meat was great, but it was a shame Roy only gained 0.1 EXP from it, and he understood that killing creatures was the best way to level up. I can level up quickly even if I only make a few kills every other day. Roy was starting to look forward to his butchering life. Chapter 5 in Gwent. As the night turned dark, the villagers started blowing their candlelights out. The men went to sleep with their wives beside them, while the children stared into the night sky and counted the sheep. Thompson, the night patrol, went around the village with nothing but a torch and his rusty sword. His job was to chase away any beasts or bandits, and to signal everyone if danger was coming. The only places that were still bright were the chief's home and the ramshackle inn in the village center, Old Captain's Inn. Occasionally, single young men with time to spare would frequent the inn to spend the night away from home. Once they had a few drinks, they'd get high and call the inn's boss, One-Eyed Jack, for a game of Gwent. One-Eyed Jack was a bearded man who loved to brag about his younger days that were spent on the seas of Skellige Isles. Old Captain's Inn was illuminated warmly by the crackling fireplace and the luminescent candles that hung along the walls. It was a quiet place, one where a few customers were enjoying their drinks after a day of hard work. Roy was standing before the Gwent game board, and his eyes gleamed as he looked at the delicate, beautiful cards. Gods, these are actual Gwent cards. Gwent was first created by a dwarf as a way to stave off boredom, but it quickly grew in popularity thanks to its simple rules and interesting and ever-changing gameplay. Nobles and civilians alike loved to play a few matches in their spare time. The characters in the cards were based on the legendary characters in the world, such as King Imhir of Nilfgaard, King Foltest of Temeria, King Dimavend of Edern, who was wearing a crown, and the beautiful Queen Meve of Lyria and Rydia. Every Gwent card was a dwarf's labor of love. Their flawless craftsmanship, gorgeous artwork, and perfect design were divine and impossible to forge. Some of the unique cards were created by a dwarf grandmaster, making them masterpieces. A normal card would usually go for a couple of crowns at most, and most shops would sell a few of them. Some of the rarer ones could cost as much as a house in Vingerberg, the capital of Edern, but the collectors who would sell those were scarce. After watching a few matches, Roy saw Nilfgaardian decks, Northern Kingdom decks, and even Skellige Isles decks, but there were no monster cards or Scoia'tael decks. Monster cards were rare, while Scoia'tael decks, well, Scoia'tael was an alliance who helped Nilfgaard ambush the humans in the Northern Kingdoms in the war. The Northern War hadn't begun yet in the year 1260, which meant nobody knew of Scoia'tael, and that meant no decks. Scoia'tael decks would only emerge after the Northern War, where a dwarf grandmaster would create the expansion pack. Hey Roy, why aren't you at home? It's past your bedtime. You shouldn't be in an inn. When One-Eyed Jack tried to pat Roy's head with his furry hand, Roy evaded it easily. Roy gave him a sheepish grin. He was only 13, so acting cute wasn't something to be ashamed about. As long as it gets me what I need. I'm waiting for Brandon, Jack. He said he'd treat me to some fruit wine tonight. Roy lied. He was waiting because he had a deal to keep. He'd teach Brandon a simple magic trick he'd learned online in his past life. The Gwent match came as a surprise, though. Roy thought he could make some money out of it, for the players in Witcher 3 would invariably get addicted to Gwent. An ugly smile carved itself on One-Eyed Jack's weathered, wrinkly face. That fatso? He'd steal his old man's money just to have some booze here. His wine is diluted with water, though. If I didn't do that, old Fletcher would have found out about it and hooped his ass. Don't pick up that habit. At the same time, his eyes shone, and One-Eyed Jack quickly placed a white Gwent card on the board. That play turned his opponent's face as white as the card One-Eyed Jack placed. Take this, Otter. Biting Thrust. All your close combat card strength is now 1. 35 to 20. Game, set, and match. Jack pulled the crowns to himself, the coins clattering against the table as they moved. Otter the farmer's face fell. Damn it! My luck's worse than the fish in Cover. That's it. I'm out for the night. He darted out of the inn. Then Roy quickly took his place and stared at One-Eyed Jack. Sit somewhere else, boy. My old friend's coming, and tonight I'm going to win all his crowns. I ain't taking no for an answer. Jack, since we both have nothing to do, why don't I play with you as your warm-up? Jack shook his head. Do you even have Gwent cards? There's no way a kid would have the money for Gwent. Aw, come on. Everyone knows Captain Jack's a collector. You have tons of cards in your collection. There must be more than one copy of some. Can't you just make a deck for me? Roy clasped his hands and gazed at Jack with sparkling eyes. Jack sighed. You used to be so sweet and sheepish. What happened to you? Did someone drill obstinance into your head? You sure won't back down. Jack raised his hand to smack Roy, but then he remembered something, and he stopped. Fine, I owe you this. I can lend you my cards, but there's no point playing Gwent without any bets. If you lose, you'll have to clean up my inn once. Deal? What if I win? You get 1 crown. But you got 2 crowns per win, Roy blurted. Jack was about to fly into a rage, but Roy covered his mouth before he could say anything else. A short while later, Roy had a Northern Realms deck made out of 35 cards. 31 of them were unit cards that had a strength of 6 or less, and 4 were weather cards. There wasn't even one unique hero card. Not one. Gwent cards were smooth and soft to the touch. It felt even better than a teenage girl's perfect skin, and for an instant, Roy was reluctant to let them go. On the other hand, Roy had no idea about One-Eyed Jack's deck. The game started shortly after. Sometime later, Brandon scurried to the table to watch the match, and a dark-skinned man measuring over 6 feet 4 came along. Note, 6 feet 4 is around 1.93 meters. They did nothing but watch silently. Roy started the game slow, playing his cards hesitantly. On the other hand, Jack was nonchalant. He crossed his arms whenever it was Roy's turn, and he played lightning fast when it was his. Roy inevitably lost the first 2 rounds. However, as the matches went on, Roy ended up turning the tables, winning match after match. Jack stared at the board, unblinking. He found it harder to make his moves, and his face fell after every loss. You cheated, you little bastard! Jack roared as he shot up. It was half an hour later. His face was red from the tension, and he looked like an angered lion. Before he could do anything, an impossible muscly hand pushed him down to a seat. I've been watching the whole time, Captain. Roy didn't cheat. I guarantee it. Seeger had a sure look on his face, though a smile spread across his lips silently. He loved it when Jack lost, for Seeger never won a Gwent match against him. Roy gave the red-haired man a look of gratitude. The man was Seeger, a Kaer villager and blacksmith who worked as a repairman for the villagers' farming tools. Roy heard that Seeger used to be in Jack's crew, and they had run a trade ship on the Skellige Isles. After Jack's retirement, Seeger came with him to Eatern to settle down. Seeger wasn't born and raised in Eatern. He was a Skellige Isles local, and the man was an honest one. You should thank the horse that crashed into you, Roy. Seeger smacked Roy's head. You used to act like a girl, but now you're starting to look like a man. After that little episode, the Gwent match went on for half an hour, totaling to 8 matches in the end. One-Eyed Jack lost 5 of them, and a whopping 5 crowns sat quietly on Roy's side of the table. He'd have to work with Fletcher for more than a month to earn what he'd made during that one night. Unbelievable. Are you really siding with this brat, oh great Melitel? My deck is 2 times better than his, but I lost 5 matches? This can't be real. Even if he's skilled, he can't beat me that easily. Still frustrated over his loss, Jack glowered at Roy. Roy worried silently after being glared at. Did I go too far? He did cheat, but nobody saw it. Roy kept 2 weather cards in his inventory space when nobody was looking, and throughout the matches, he'd swapped his cards to freeze Jack's units. That lowered their strength, which Jack worked so hard to pile up. Gods, that was fun. Because I am lucky. Roy tried to sound as calm as possible. Nobody is luckier than me when it comes to Gwent. The great Melitel has granted me her blessing. Damn it! Jack slammed the wall, and it shook from the impact. If it weren't for that damn thief, Sasha, you wouldn't have one. She stole my mysterious elf. Sasha? Roy paused for a moment at the mention of that name. He thought he'd met Sasha in the game, but he couldn't remember who she was. Brandon, the little fat kid, thought about it and shouted, Isn't Sasha the rider who knocked into Roy? The mention of the accident made Jack give up dwelling on his loss. Forget it. If it weren't for me chasing after her, she wouldn't have panicked and crashed into Roy. I'll let this matter slide today. Roy connected the dots and realized why Jack said he owed him, and why he was willing to lend a Gwent deck. So it's because he has a rare card, and a thief came to steal it. That's why Roy got knocked out and merged with me. Come here at the same time tomorrow night, Roy. We'll have a few matches. You won't be lucky forever. I'll find out how you cheat one way or another. Roy took the offer without hesitation. He made 5 crowns in half an hour, so there was no reason not to let his greatest source of income go. Captain Jack's as addicted to Gwent as those dwarves who got bankrupt because of it. Brandon, wanting to have a piece of the show, tugged on Roy's sleeve. Roy, teach me that magic trick. He whipped out a handful of aromatic, sweet, yellowish snacks from his pocket and popped them into Roy's mouth. Those are cracklings. They're delicious, aren't they? Fletcher cooks up cracklings every time he slaughters a pig. You teach me some tricks, and I'll bring you snacks every day. Roy looked at the naive, childish, chubby boy and smiled. He flattened out a single strand of hair that poked out from Brandon's head. Let's make it quick. We'll have to go to bed soon. Chapter 6 New Skill and Level Up. Tranquil days passed by quietly like a flowing river. Before he knew it, Roy had been working as an apprentice for nearly a month, and he spent many nights getting into Gwent matches in the inn. Slowly but surely, Roy started to blend into the familiar yet alien Kaer. Over the month of working and playing Gwent, Roy managed to save up 60 crowns, most of which came from Jack and Seeger. The money was enough to sustain a trip to Vinterberg or any big city. Roy wanted to win more crowns, but Seeger and Jack started bringing their guards up when around him. They stopped playing Gwent with him, and Roy lost his greatest source of income. Ever since he got to know Seeger, Roy kept asking him about his hometown, the Skellige Isles. He was trying to forge a bond with Seeger. He spent 50 crowns purchasing a dagger and a small crossbow from Seeger. Gotta protect myself, you see? The crossbow was called Gabriel, named after the forger of Verdun. It was gray in color, and Roy could hold it with one hand. Seeger also gave him 20 wooden crossbow bolts as a gift. Any other Eastern blacksmith wouldn't have sold Gabriel to a scrawny boy like Roy, but Seeger was different. He came from the Skellige Isles, and he was an honest man. Seeger believed that a man should always possess a weapon from a young age in order to stay safe amidst the chaos. Children as young as 10 would have started swinging weapons around on Skellige Isles, so he didn't mind selling Gabriel, especially when he had taken a liking to Roy. Compared to the crossbows that could have been easily found in the game, the crossbow Seeger gave him was powerful. It might have had an outdated structure, short range, and slow reload, but at least crossbows didn't demand any skill. Even weak children, and the elderly could use it. As long as they held it steady and shot straight, even elite soldiers could be hurt. The crossbow was the perfect choice for Roy, who had no combat experience and had a lower constitution than the average adult. At least it was better than a melee weapon. His perception rivaled an adult's, and he had a broad range of sight, making him an efficient ranged fighter. Roy kept his dagger and crossbow in his inventory space. It was a convenient thing for Roy. Aside from being unable to keep living beings, the only restriction was size. He could keep anything as long as it didn't exceed the maximum space. All he had to do was think about the item, and it would show up in his hands. As dawn broke through the horizon, the dewdrops on the weeds flanking the street started to glisten under the sunlight. Roy, as usual, was going to the butcher's place. He would wave at the villagers on the way there, but most of them ignored him. Kaer was a traditional place. The villagers held the belief that children should inherit their parents' business. They thought Roy should just toil the fields, but instead he went to learn the skills of a butcher, spend his nights in the inn, and even made a friend out of the outsider from the Skellige Isles. His aberrant behavior garnered him nothing but the villagers' jealousy and nasty whispers. If he was the original Roy, he would have locked himself up where the sun didn't shine after hearing the rumors, but the current Roy didn't care about them. If his plan went well, he'd level up first before going out into the wild and hunting with his new weapons. He could just get some kills and sell the animals' skins for some crowns. Of course, he'd keep on learning the trade of the butcher. Something like a hunting license might have existed in big cities, but a small, remote village like Kaer wasn't bound under that regulation. Roy could hunt all he wanted. Once he leveled up a few more times, Roy thought he would be able to defend himself well enough. After he made some money, he'd try to bring more and Susie to Novigrad and settle there. He'd have to make sure his parents were safe before he could go off in his pursuit of strength and explore the wonderful world he was in. Messages started flooding his mind. Aretuza, the Academy for Young Ladies, was located in the Thanet Isles, Gorsveelen, while Ban Art Academy for Young Men was located in Kedwin. The stronghold of the Wolf School, Kaer Morhen, was located in the Blue Mountains, which was east of Kedwin. It was there that Vesemir lived. All the places the messages told him about were in his exploration plan, and Roy intended to check off everything on his bucket list. However, for the time being, he'd take the first step to his momentous journey, killing more livestock. Then he'd level up. After a month of continuous scolding and teachings from the butcher, as well as the sweat and blood Roy sacrificed for his work, his stats changed ever so slightly. Roy. Age, 13 years and 8 months old. Status, civilian. HP, 41. Strength, 4.2. Dexterity, 5.1. Constitution, 4.1. Perception, 5. Will, 4.5. Charisma, 5. Spirit, 6. You unlocked a new skill. Unnamed, passive level 1. You have killed and dismembered more than 4 types of animals. Your total kill and dismemberment has exceeded 15. You now have a bloody aura around you. The aura cannot be dispelled. You have a 1% chance to fear any enemies within a 1-foot range. If the enemy has a lower will than you, you have a 1% chance to cause it to lose control over its body. You have an understanding of the anatomy of mammals, pigs, cows, goats, dogs, etc. You know how to control your strength and weapon to bypass their skin, muscle, and bones to attack their weakness. Your damage against creatures with a similar anatomy is permanently increased by 1%. Tip: this skill will level up according to the number and types of creatures you kill. Note: 1 foot is around 0.3 meters. Inventory space, 1 cubic meter. Other, unknown. EXP, 98 by 100 foot. After a month of intense training and enough food to eat, Roy's strength, constitution, and dexterity saw a slight increase. His face was no longer a stark contrast to his jet black hair, but instead had a pink glow of health to it. Roy was obviously sturdier than he was a month ago. He was still scrawny, but at least he had shed the feeling of extreme weakness. Will was the attribute that saw the biggest increase, but Roy thought it was natural. Anyone would have an iron will after having puked for a month and kept on working in a bloody, squalid, and rancid environment. Roy could feel something evil coming from his new passive skill. The odds of it activating and the damage increase it provided were only 1%, because it was only a level 1 skill after all. The damage increase would help in at least some situations. Besides, the skill could level up through skill point distribution and the moment Roy made enough kills. Since I got this skill through the butcher's teaching, and it levels up through killing, why don't I call it? Roy gave it a name, and the unnamed skill was called Massacre. On the way back to his house, Roy bumped into Brandon, who tried to ram into him. Brandon had a special affinity with magic. He only spent a month mastering the little tricks Roy taught him, such as the prophecy, the magical hay, and the phantom fork, and he was already performing them perfectly. Roy wasn't sure if Brandon could be a bard, but he knew Brandon could be a magician if he wanted to. After being harassed by Brandon for a month, Roy had already held up his end of the bargain, and he had no desire to play along with Brandon anymore. "How many times have I told you? I taught you everything I know, so let me go, you snotty brat." Brandon's eyes were filled with the desire for knowledge. "It's fine. You can get a gander of this trick I improvised on. Man, if I perform this when I become a bard, the whole Kaer's going to be surprised. No, the whole lower Posada. Not interested. I have a job to do. I can give you some cracklings. Fletcher made it yesterday." Brandon gave him a sycophantic smile. That was the first time the little guy had to beg for a favor. Usually it was the other way around, but after finding out about magic and falling in love with it, Brandon showed an unprecedented passion for it. Roy stood his ground. "Then show it to your dad, or your lackeys. Brady and the gang would love to praise you for your show." "My dad? He's going to kick my ass." Brandon held Roy's hand and insisted. "And I can't show those guys. They're just kids. They can't give me any ideas to improve. You're the only one around who can." Roy stared into his eyes and cruelly replied, "Stop coming to me. I have a job, and I need to settle something important. Never talk to me about magic tricks ever again. If you don't have anyone to show off to, why don't you show it to your mother?" Brandon froze, and he looked down in silence. After Roy shook Brandon off, he went to Fletcher's house and noticed a couple of people struggling against a big white pig. Fletcher was clamping down on its head, while a villager tried to pull on its tail, but the pig dragged them around and oinked loudly. Roy hastened and pinned the pig down, then Fletcher fed it the anesthetic, and it finally stopped squirming. Fletcher plopped down onto the pig's dirty back, but didn't complain. The flaps on his face trembled as he moved, and he asked, sounding nonchalant, "You saw that brat, didn't you, Roy?" "Yeah. He went to show off his magic tricks to some kids. Call him back for me once we butcher this pig. That brat stood the chief off again." Fletcher rubbed his nose and whispered, "I did yell at him a bit too harshly though, so help me out. I don't want him to run around in a fit of anger." "He just doesn't know how to show that he cares, doesn't he?" Roy thought, and he agreed to help out. With Fletcher's help, Roy killed the fat pig in one strike. Once the blood had finished flowing out, his EXP bar filled, and Roy felt a weak quake from his character sheet. He then excused himself and sat down somewhere quiet. When he looked at his character sheet, There was a plus sign after the EXP bar. After concentrating his mind on the plus sign, a new message showed up on the sheet. Level 1, 3 by 500. At the same time, a surge of warmth flowed through his body. It felt like inner energy, chi, or as they called it, chaos energy. At the same time, a plus sign showed up after every stat and his skill massacre. He gained 1 attribute point and 1 skill point from the level up. Roy was overjoyed, but he held his excitement back and observed his stats closely. His strength was 4.2, constitution 4.1, and will 4.5. Those stats were weaker than an average adult. Even if he added 1 point to any one of them, it wouldn't provide him with any edge in combat. He could just keep working as an apprentice to the butcher, and his body would eventually grow into the stats of an adult. There was no point in wasting a hard-earned point on that. He had no desire to become someone who relied on their looks for a living, so charisma wasn't in his list of considerations. That left spirit, perception, and dexterity for him, and it was those stats that Roy was paying attention to. He was on par with an average adult in those stats, and his spirit was 1 point higher than a normal adult's. In his case, where he had little attribute points, Roy would prefer to increase his advantage rather than to be a master of all trades. However, Roy hadn't mastered any spell, nor had he come into contact with pseudo-spells like the Witcher signs. Since spirit would only increase the strength of spells, Roy wouldn't add a point to spirit. So only perception and dexterity are left. Adding a point to dexterity would increase his reaction speed and sight when he was moving. It would increase his efficiency in utilizing Gabriel, which would help in his plan. Adding 1 point in perception would grant him a clearer view of his surroundings. It could be used in defense and premonition. A higher perception would also help with his observation skills and sight, which could increase his efficiency with Gabriel. After pondering upon the matter long and hard, Roy came to a decision. I'll go with perception then. The moment he thought of adding that point into perception, perception had its point increased by 1, making it a total of 6. At the same time, a stronger surge of warmth flowed through his whole body. Roy fell into a state of transcendence after he heightened his perception. The world itself became livelier in his eyes. Roy could faintly smell the stench of blood coming from the butcher's house, and when he looked into the growths of grass, Roy could see the dewdrops on the tips of their blades and the ladybug that sparkled bright red as it crossed the leaves. He could feel the flow of the air as it brushed against his fingertips before dancing away into the space ahead. The air itself felt warm to the touch, and it enveloped him in a gentle manner. Everything around him became livelier and more magical than Roy had ever imagined. He stayed in that trance for the longest time before slowly snapping out of it. And then he added his skill point into Massacre, leveling it up by 1 level. Massacre was currently level 2. It was only a 1 level increase, but the damage increase and activation chance spiked. They were only 1% at level 1, but they were both 5% at level 2. The addition to perception didn't change Roy's physique though. Roy was delighted by the improvements he made, and he was confident that his following plan would work out. The euphoria from leveling up swept everything away from his mind, and he had forgotten the request Fletcher asked of him. This marks the end of part 2 of the story, The Divine Hunter. Thank you for listening. Please like the video and hit the subscribe button to listen more. Hit the bell icon to get notified of all the new content uploaded to the channel ASAP.